So when you see the headlines about Iran, what's really going on behind them? It feels like the country is at this massive crossroads, right? To really get it, we've got to look deeper at the forces that have been shaping things for decades. In this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll connect the dots from the country's history to what's happening on the streets today and what could come next. All right, let's dive in. You know, this quote from an Iranian entrepreneur, Ali Najafzadeh, really gets to the heart of everything. He says, "I am an Iranian and I cannot remain silent about what is happening in my country." Just think about that for a second. That's not a political statement. That's personal. It captures this feeling of urgency that's fueling so much of what we're seeing. It's the perfect place for us to start. Okay, so here's our roadmap for understanding how we got here. First, we'll look at the system's history. Then, we'll get into the growing public frustration. After that, we'll see how that boils over into national protests. We'll also cover the government's response. And finally, we'll look at the future and the crossroads Iran is facing. All right, let's jump into our first section, the system's long history. Because, honestly, to get a handle on today's protests, you have to understand the pressure that's been building for, well, over 4 decades. This is really where the story of all this discontent begins. So, the first thing you've got to wrap your head around is this. The current system, the Islamic Republic, isn't some new thing. It's been in power for more than 40 years. That's huge. It means what we're seeing today isn't a reaction to just one event. No way. It's the result of this long, slow pressure cooker building up steam over generations. And this timeline here, it really shows you how that pressure just kept stacking up. You start with the 1979 revolution. Then through the 90s and 2000s, you see more and more restrictions on personal freedoms. Then come the 2010s and bam, crippling economic crises hit. It's like layer after layer of strain, and it all leads right here to the 2020s, where all that pressure has just erupted. And when you have that much history, all those challenges, it leads to this really important idea, a loss of legitimacy. So what does that actually mean? Well, think about it. When you've got decades of repression, deep corruption, and economic hardship all piling up, a government starts to lose the single most important thing it has, and that's the trust of its own people. Okay, moving on to our second section, the people's growing frustration. So we just talked about this big idea, loss of legitimacy. But what does that actually feel like for an ordinary person? On a human level, that's what we're looking at now, the real daily impact. So what's really driving all this frustration? Well, it seems to boil down to 3 main things that you hear about over and over again. First, this sense of deep structural corruption. Second, a severe economic crisis that makes just getting by a daily struggle. And third, these really harsh restrictions on individual personal freedoms. And I really want to stress this point. We're not talking about some small fringe group here. This feeling is widespread. A huge portion of Iranian society seems to have hit a breaking point. They're not just asking for small tweaks anymore. They want a fundamental change to the entire system. Which brings us right to Section 3, protests across the nation. Because what happens when that level of frustration finally just boils over? Well, it turns into action. It spills out onto the streets. So you have to ask, right? When so many people feel this way, how do they show it? How does all that frustration actually come out? Well, the answer is pretty clear. It comes out in widespread protests. And this is so important to understand. These aren't just isolated events happening in 1 or 2 cities. We are talking about demonstrations flaring up all across Iran. It's a truly national movement. And if you listen to the chants, to what people are actually demanding in the streets, a few key themes keep coming up. They're demanding freedom, they're protesting the terrible economic situation, and they are very openly expressing their opposition to the government. These are really the unifying cries you hear. But as you can imagine, taking to the streets like that, it comes with a huge, huge risk. And that brings us to Section 4, the government's violent response and the high cost of speaking out. The official response to these protests has been pretty consistent, and it has been severe. The source material, citing human rights reports, shows that time and time again, these demonstrations have been met with violent crackdowns from the authorities. And the human cost, it is just staggering. According to those same reports, over the past few years, thousands of protesters have reportedly been killed. Think about that number. It just shows you the lethal danger people are facing just for making their voices heard. And it's not just the number of people killed. The scale of the repression is also massive when you look at arrests.
We're talking tens of thousands of people arrested or thrown in prison, many of them just for protesting.
I mean, this really shows the massive disconnect, doesn't it? On one side, you have people asking for basic things, freedom, a stable economy, security. And on the other side, the official response is repression, severe violence, and arrests. The two sides just couldn't be farther apart. So, where does all this go from here? That's the huge question, and it brings us to our final section, Iran's uncertain future. What comes next? And what's pretty incredible is that despite all the risks, all the danger we just talked about, so many people are not leaving Iran. They're staying. They're continuing to hold on to this hope for real, meaningful political change. But what does change actually look like? Well, there's no single easy answer. It's a huge debate happening right now. You've got some people who hope for reforms within the existing system. You have many others who are pushing for a complete overhaul, a total systemic change. And then there's even talk from some about a return to a monarchy. But here's the thing. Even with all these different ideas about the how, there seems to be a fundamental goal that unites a lot of people. The main demand, it's for a government that is accountable to its citizens, a government that respects people instead of repressing them. It's as simple and as complicated as that. And that really leaves us with the central burning question for Iran today. What is the right path to a government that can actually build a better, safer, freer future for the next generation? Nobody knows for sure what that path will look like. The stakes are unbelievably high, but for so many Iranians, the destination, that ultimate goal, has never been clearer.